In the quiet little town of Willow Creek, life moved at its own pace. The air smelled of fresh hay, and the fields stretched endlessly under wide-open skies. It was a place where people knew each other by name, shared stories over coffee, and helped one another when times got tough. For James Callahan, this town was more than just a spot on the map, it was home. Or at least it was supposed to be. James wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He grew up working odd jobs, fixing fences, helping neighbors with their livestock, and doing whatever he could to make ends meet. But deep down, he always dreamed of having his own piece of land, a place where he could build something that would last. A place he could call his own. After years of saving every penny, skipping meals, and working long hours, James finally saved enough money to buy an old farmhouse on 5 acres of land outside town. The house wasn't much to look at. Its paint was peeling, the roof leaked in places, and the barn looked like it might collapse any day. But none of that mattered to James. To him, it was perfect. It was a blank canvas, a chance to create something beautiful out of nothing. On the day he signed the papers, he stood on the porch, looked out at the rolling hills, and smiled. This was it, the start of a new chapter. For months, James poured his heart and soul into fixing up the place. Every weekend, he worked tirelessly, hammering nails, painting walls, and mending broken boards. His hands were calloused, his back ached, but he didn't care. There was a kind of joy in seeing the house come alive again. Slowly but surely, the old farmhouse transformed into a cozy, welcoming space. The barn, once leaning precariously to one side, now stood sturdy and proud. James even added a fresh coat of red paint to the barn doors, thinking it gave the property character. But living in Willow Creek meant being part of a community, and communities often came with rules. When James bought the land, he joined the Local Homeowners Association, HOA. At first, everything seemed fine. The HOA promised things like shared resources, access to water for farming, and support from fellow members. They talked about creating a close-knit neighborhood where everyone looked out for each other. James thought it sounded great. What he didn't realize was that behind the friendly smiles and promises lay a web of strict regulations that no one had bothered to explain properly. One sunny morning, James woke up early as usual. He fed his sheep, checked the fences, and headed inside to grab some breakfast. As he sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, he heard the sound of engines roaring in the distance. At first, he thought maybe someone was plowing a field nearby, but then the noise grew louder, closer. Curious, James stepped outside to see what was going on. What he saw made his blood run cold. 2 massive bulldozers were parked in front of his barn. Men in hard hats were climbing out of trucks, carrying clipboards and talking loudly. Before James could say a word, the machines roared to life and the blades began tearing into the side of his newly renovated barn. Splinters flew everywhere. The red doors he'd painted so carefully crumbled to the ground. James ran toward them, shouting, "What are you doing?" "Stop, that's my barn." But no one listened. One of the men handed him a folded piece of paper. "We're sorry," he said without looking James in the eye. "You violated the aesthetic guidelines. We gave you warnings." "Warnings?" James stared at the paper in disbelief. Sure enough, it listed a series of complaints about his property, including the color of the barn doors. Apparently, according to the HOAS rules, all barns had to be white, not red. How was he supposed to know that? No one had ever told him. And even if they had, why would such a small detail matter so much? By the time the bulldozers finished, there was nothing left of the barn except a pile of rubble. James stood there, frozen, watching as the men packed up their equipment and drove away. His mind raced with questions. Why hadn't anyone warned him sooner? Why hadn't they tried to work with him instead of destroying everything he'd worked so hard for? Most importantly, how could they treat someone like this, someone who had done nothing wrong except try to improve his own property? That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the events of the day over and over in his head. Each time, the anger burned hotter. He felt powerless, betrayed, and utterly alone. But something else stirred inside him too, a fierce determination. If the HOA thought they could push him around, they were dead wrong. This wasn't just about a barn anymore. This was personal. And James vowed to fight back, not just for himself, but for anyone else who had ever been treated unfairly by those. Empowered as dawn broke the next morning, James walked out to the edge of his property. He gazed out at the fields and hills, feeling a strange mix of sadness and resolve. Somewhere beneath the surface, he realized, ran the lifeline of the entire community, a water pipeline controlled by the HOA. Without water, the farms around him would struggle to survive. Without water, the HOA's influence would crumble. An idea began forming in James's mind, an idea that would change everything. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a battle that would shake Willow Creek to its core. The days following the demolition of his barn were some of the hardest James had ever faced. He spent hours sitting on the porch, staring at the pile of rubble that used to be his pride and joy. The red paint he'd chosen so carefully was now smeared across broken wood, a cruel reminder of how quickly everything could be taken away. But as much as it hurt, James knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this go unanswered. If the HOA thought they could destroy what he had built without consequences, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. James wasn't the kind of person who acted rashly. He didn't storm into meetings or shout threats. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He started thinking and planning. Late at night, after the sheep were fed and the chores were done, he sat at his kitchen table with a notebook, jotting down ideas. He wanted to hit the HOA where it would hurt the most. He needed leverage, something big enough to make them listen, something they couldn't ignore. That's when he remembered the pipeline, years ago. When James first bought the property, he learned that an underground water line ran through his land. It was part of an old agreement between the previous owner and the HOA. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. The pipeline supplied water to several farms in the area, including a massive sheep ranch owned by the Peterson family. Everyone depended on it, the crops, the livestock, even some of the smaller businesses in town. Without that water, life in Willow Creek would grind to a halt. James knew shutting off the water wouldn't just inconvenience the HOA, it would cripple them. The Petersons leased their land from the HOA, paying hefty fees every month. Their 1,500 sheep operation was the crown jewel of the association's portfolio, a steady source of income that kept the organization running smoothly. Without water, the sheep would suffer. Crops would fail. Livestock would die. And once word got out, other farmers might start questioning whether the HOA really had their best interests at heart. But pulling the plug on the pipeline wasn't a decision James took lightly. He wrestled with the idea for days. On one hand, he felt justified. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. They had torn down his barn without warning, without compassion. Why should he show them any mercy? On the other hand, he worried about the fallout. What if innocent people got caught in the crossfire? What if things spiraled out of control? In the end, his anger outweighed his doubts. He told himself this wasn't personal, it was business. The HOA had shown him exactly what they valued: rules over people, profit over fairness. Now it was his turn to teach them a lesson. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, James grabbed a flashlight, a wrench, and a pair of gloves. He walked out to the edge of his property where the pipeline ran beneath the surface. He'd marked the spot weeks earlier just in case he ever needed to find it again. Kneeling down, he brushed away the dirt until he uncovered the metal valve hidden below. Taking a deep breath, he turned the wrench. The sound of rushing water stopped. Abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. At first, nothing happened. James went back inside, pacing nervously as he waited for the effects to ripple outward. By morning, though, the impact was undeniable. Down at the Peterson Ranch, workers arrived to find the troughs dry and the animals restless. Pumps sputtered, uselessly, unable to draw water from the empty pipes. Confusion turned to panic as the hours ticked by. Calls were made, technicians were summoned, but no one could figure out what was wrong. The pipeline simply wasn't working. Word spread quickly. Farmers gathered in groups, whispering about sabotage. Some blamed equipment failure. Others pointed fingers at rival operations. No one suspected James, not yet. After all, he was just a quiet guy who kept to himself. Who would think he'd have the guts or the know-how to pull something like this? As the days passed, the situation grew worse. Sheep began collapsing from dehydration. Fields turned brown and brittle. The Petersons scrambled to haul in water from neighboring towns, but it wasn't nearly enough. Every day brought new losses, new frustrations. Tempers flared, accusations flew, and tension simmered just below the surface. The once thriving ranch was teetering on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, James watched from afar, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt guilty. He hated seeing animals suffer, hated knowing families were struggling because of his actions. But another part of him couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. Finally, someone was paying attention. Finally, the HOA was feeling the same helplessness he'd felt when they tore down his barn. Still, James knew this was only the beginning. Shutting off the water was one thing. Holding the HOA accountable was another. He spent his evenings researching laws, gathering evidence, and preparing for whatever came next. He documented every email he'd received from the HOA, every vague rule they'd cited, every promise they'd broken. If they came after him, and he was sure they would, he wanted to be ready. One afternoon, while tinkering with an old tractor, James noticed a car pulling up his driveway. It was Mr. Thompson, the head of the HOA board. James recognized him immediately, the same man who had handed him the eviction notice for his barn. Thompson stepped out of the car, looking uneasy. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat before speaking. "Look," he said, avoiding eye contact. "We need to talk about the water issue. We've been hearing reports of shortages, and we're trying to figure out what's going on." James leaned against the tractor, arms crossed. "Water issue?" he replied coolly. "Funny you should mention that. I heard there's been some trouble down at the Peterson Ranch." Thompson frowned. "Yes, well, it's causing a lot of problems. People are losing money. Livestock is dying. We need to resolve this quickly." James shrugged. "Sounds serious. Maybe you should check your pipelines. Could be a leak somewhere." Thompson studied him for a moment, suspicion creeping into his expression. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" James met his gaze steadily. "Me? Nah. Why would I know anything about your pipelines?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thompson sighed, muttered something under his breath, and climbed back into his car. As he drove away, James felt a surge of adrenaline. The game was on. Whatever happened next, he was ready. And so the battle lines were drawn. James had struck the first blow, exposing the HOS vulnerabilities and forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions. But he also knew this was far from over. The real fight was just beginning, and it would test not only his courage but the very fabric of the community itself. The days that followed Mr. Thompson's visit were tense, to say the least. James knew he was playing with fire, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. The HOA had started this fight by bulldozing his barn, and they weren't going to walk away unscathed. Still, as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in, James found himself questioning whether he'd gone too far. Was shutting off the water really the right move? Could he handle the consequences if things spiraled out of control? But it wasn't just about him anymore. The ripple effects of his actions were spreading across Willow Creek like wildfire. Farmers who depended on the Peterson Ranch for supplies were feeling the pinch. Local businesses that sold feed, tools, and equipment saw their sales drop overnight. Even families who didn't rely directly on farming felt the strain. Higher prices at the market, fewer jobs available, and a growing sense of unease hanging over the town. Despite all the chaos, no one could figure out who was behind the water shortage. Rumors flew faster than the wind. Some people whispered about environmental activists trying to make a statement. Others pointed fingers at rival farmers looking to sabotage the competition. A few even suggested it might be an inside job, a disgruntled employee or board member settling scores. No one, not even the HOA, suspected James. They were too busy scrambling to fix the problem to consider that the quiet man living on the hill might be responsible. Meanwhile, the HOA pulled out all the stops. Engineers were brought in to inspect the pipeline, but every test came back inconclusive. Private investigators combed through records, interviewed locals, and searched for any clue that might lead them to the culprit. Law enforcement got involved, though reluctantly. They had bigger issues to deal with than a broken pipe. But the harder they looked, the more frustrated they became. Whoever had done this was good. Too good. James, for his part, stayed calm and kept his head down. He went about his daily routine like nothing had changed. He fed his sheep, mended fences, and tinkered with his tractor. If anyone asked how he was doing, he gave the same answer: just another day on the farm. Inside, though, he was anything but relaxed. Every knock on the door made his heart race. Every phone call set his nerves on edge. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots to prepare for that moment. James spent his evenings building a case against the HOA. He dug up old emails, letters, and documents that proved how poorly they'd treated him. There was the vague notice about aesthetic guidelines that never mentioned barn colors. There were the ignored requests for clarification when he asked about renovations. And then there was the final straw, the demolition crew showing up without warning, destroying months of hard work in a matter of hours. He also reached out to a few trusted neighbors, sharing his story and asking for advice. Not everyone agreed with his methods, but many sympathized with his situation. One elderly farmer, whose family had lived in Willow Creek for generations, told James, "You're not the first person they've pushed around, and you won't be the last. But maybe your fight can change things for the rest of us." Those words stuck with James. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about standing up for himself and for everyone else who had been bullied by the HOA. If he played his cards right, he might actually force them to change their ways. That thought gave him strength. Even as the pressure mounted, then came the letter. It arrived early one morning, slipped under his front door while he was out tending to the sheep. When James picked it up, his stomach sank. It was official looking, with the HOA logo stamped across the top. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper and began to read. The letter accused him of tampering with the pipeline and demanded that he restore water access immediately. It threatened legal action if he refused, citing violations of property laws and potential damages caused by his negligence. The tone was cold, clinical, and completely devoid of empathy. To them, This was just another problem to solve, a loose end to tie up before moving on. James laughed bitterly as he finished reading. Negligence? They had the nerve to accuse him of negligence after everything they'd done? Shaking his head, he set the letter aside and grabbed his notebook. He wasn't going to roll over and play victim. Not this time. Instead, he drafted a response. In clear, concise language, he laid out his side of the story. He explained how the HOA had demolished his barn without proper communication or justification. He detailed the financial and emotional toll it had taken on him. And he ended with a simple demand: full compensation for the loss of his barn. A barn. Public apology, and a commitment to reform their policies. Only then would he consider restoring water access. When the letter arrived at the HOA office, it sent shockwaves through the board. For weeks, they'd been chasing shadows, blaming everyone but themselves for the water crisis. Now, suddenly, they had a suspect, and worse, a motive. Panic set in as they realized James wasn't just some random troublemaker. He was one of their own members, someone they'd wronged so badly that he was willing to take drastic measures to get justice done. At first, they tried to dismiss his demands as ridiculous. "We can't negotiate with extortionists," one board member argued during an emergency meeting. But others weren't so sure. They knew the longer the water stayed off, the more damage it would do to the ranch, to the community, and to their reputation. Plus, there was the uncomfortable fact that James had a point. Their handling of his case had been sloppy, to say the least. If word got out about how they treated him, it could spell disaster for the organization. As the debate raged on, tensions in Willow Creek continued to rise. Farmers gathered in small groups, venting their frustrations and speculating about who was behind the water shortage. Some defended the HOA, saying they were doing the best they could under difficult circumstances. Others criticized them, calling for transparency and accountability. The divide grew wider with each passing day. One evening, as James sat on his porch watching the sunset, he heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Looking up, he saw a pickup truck pull into his driveway. Out stepped two men, one older, with a weathered face and calloused hands. The other younger, probably in his late 20s. Both wore cowboy hats and carried serious expressions. "Mind if we sit for a minute?" the older man asked, nodding toward the porch steps. James hesitated but nodded. "Sure. What's on your mind?" The older man introduced himself as a local farmer who leased land from the HOA. His son worked part-time at the Peterson Ranch, helping with the sheep. They weren't there to accuse James of anything. They just wanted answers. "We've heard rumors," the younger man said cautiously. "People are saying you might have something to do with the water issue. Is it true?" James studied them for a moment, weighing his options. He could deny it, play dumb, and send them on their way. Or he could tell them the truth, or at least part of it. In the end, he decided honesty was the better choice. "I'm not proud of what I did," he admitted, "but I didn't do it for kicks. The HOA destroyed my barn without giving me a chance to explain myself. They broke the rules first. All I did was hold them accountable." The two men exchanged glances. Neither seemed surprised exactly, but neither looked angry either. After a long pause, the older man spoke again. "You know, a lot of us have had run-ins with the HOA over the years. They don't care about us. They care about money. Maybe you're onto something here. But you gotta be careful. Once this blows up, there's no turning back." James nodded slowly. He already knew that, but hearing it from someone else made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was everyone's fight. Whether they liked it or not, the entire community was caught in the crossfire. As the men drove away, James leaned back in his chair, staring at the horizon. The sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. He felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Fear because he knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Hope because, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The tension in Willow Creek was thicker than ever. Everyone could feel it. The farmers, the shopkeepers, even the kids playing on the dirt roads after school. Conversations that once revolved around crops and weather now centered on one thing: the water crisis. Whispers filled the air at the local diner, where people gathered for coffee and gossip. The Peterson Ranch's struggles were no longer a secret. They were front-page news in the small-town rumor mill. James knew he had stirred up something big. Every day he watched as the HOA scrambled to regain control, their polished image cracking under the weight of accusations and unanswered questions. But what James didn't expect was how deeply his actions would split the community. Some saw him as a hero man standing up against an unfair system. Others viewed him as reckless, someone who'd gone too far and put everyone else at risk. And then there were those still sitting on the fence, unsure which side to take but feeling the pressure to choose. It all came to a head when the HOA called an emergency town hall meeting. Flyers went up around town overnight, urging residents to attend. Your voice matters. The flyers read, printed in bold letters beneath the HOA logo. It sounded like an invitation to share concerns, but James knew better. This wasn't about listening, it was about damage control. They wanted to present themselves as victims, paint him as the villain, and rally support from the community. The night of the meeting, the old community center buzzed with energy. Farmers in flannel shirts sat alongside retirees in cardigans. Teenagers slouched against the walls, scrolling on their phones while pretending not to care. Even the mayor showed up, looking uncomfortable in his suit among the sea of work boots and denim. The room smelled faintly of damp hay and stale coffee, a reminder of where everyone came from and what was at stake. James arrived late, slipping into a seat near the back. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but it was impossible to blend in. People turned to look as he entered, some nodding in solidarity, others glaring with suspicion. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, and focused on the stage where the HOA board members sat lined up like judges at a trial. Mr. Thompson, the head of the HOA, stood to address the crowd. His voice boomed through the microphone, overly confident despite the cracks showing in his composure. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we've called this meeting because we're facing unprecedented challenges in our community. Someone has sabotaged our water supply, causing devastating losses for families across Willow Creek. We believe this act was deliberate, an attack on our way of life. Murmurs rippled through the room. James clenched his fists under the table, but kept his expression neutral. Thompson continued, pointing fingers without naming names. Whoever did this is putting innocent people at risk. Livestock are dying. Crops are failing. Businesses are suffering. This isn't just vandalism, it's an assault on everything we hold dear. When he finished, the room erupted into chaos. Voices rose in anger, frustration, and disbelief. One farmer shouted, "How do you know it's sabotage? Maybe it's just bad maintenance." Another chimed in, "Yeah, I've seen leaks before. They never fix anything until it's too late." Thompson tried to regain control, raising his hands for silence, but the crowd wasn't having it. That's when James decided to speak up. Standing slowly, he made his way to the front of the room. The murmurs died down as everyone turned to watch him. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots. "I'm not here to argue with anyone," James sighed, his voice steady but firm. "But I think it's time we talked about why this happened in the first place." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he launched into his story how he'd spent years saving money to buy his property, how he'd worked tirelessly to renovate the barn, and how the HOA had bulldozed it without warning or explanation. They told me I broke the rules, James said, holding up the vague notice he'd received months ago. But they never said which rules. They never gave me a chance to fix it. Instead, they sent bulldozers to tear down my home. My home. And now they have the nerve to call me or whoever they're blaming a criminal? The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. James let the weight of his words hang in the air before continuing. This isn't just about me. It's about every single person in this room who's ever felt powerless against the HOA. How many times have they ignored your complaints? How many times have they changed the rules without telling you? How many times have they treated us like numbers instead of human beings? As he spoke, heads began to nod. A few people clapped softly, then louder. Others leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Even the skeptics couldn't deny the truth in what he was saying. The HOA wasn't just fighting James anymore, they were fighting the entire town. Thompson tried to interrupt, stammering something about misinformation and emotional appeals, but no one listened. The tide had turned. When James finally sat back down, the room erupted into applause. Farmers slapped him on the back, thanking him for speaking up. Retirees wiped tears from their eyes, remembering their own battles with the HOA. Even the mayor gave him a reluctant nod of respect, but the HOA wasn't ready to give up. One board member stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You can't justify breaking the law," she snapped. "No matter what you think of us, shutting off the water is dangerous. Innocent people are suffering because of your selfishness." Her words hit a nerve. A young woman in the audience stood up, cradling a baby in her arms. Her husband worked at the Peterson Ranch, and she'd been quiet until now. Selfish? She shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. "My husband hasn't slept in days because he's hauling water buckets to keep the sheep alive. Our bills are piling up, and we don't know how we're going to feed our kids next month. So tell me, who's being selfish here?" The room erupted again, this time in agreement. The HOA board looked shell-shocked, their carefully crafted arguments crumbling under the weight of raw emotion. For the first time, they realized they weren't dealing with a lone troublemaker. They were facing an entire community fed up with their arrogance and indifference. By the end of the meeting, it was clear nothing would be the same again. James had ignited a spark, forcing people to confront issues they'd long ignored. As he walked out of the community center, the cool night air hit his face and he exhaled deeply. He didn't know what would happen next, whether the HOA would retaliate, whether the townsfolk would stand by him, or whether he'd end up in legal trouble. But one thing was certain, the battle lines had been redrawn. And for the first time, James felt like he might actually win. He climbed into his truck and drove home, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The stars above seemed brighter tonight, twinkling like tiny reminders of hope. Whatever tomorrow brought, he was ready. The days after the town hall meeting felt like a storm waiting to break. Willow Creek was buzzing with talk about what had happened, how James had stood up to the HOA, how he'd laid bare their failures in front of the entire community. Some people cheered him on, calling him a hero for finally standing up to the bullies. Others still whispered behind closed doors, worried about the fallout and whether things would ever go back to normal. But one thing was undeniable. The HOA's grip on the town was slipping. James knew it too. As much as the town hall had been a victory, he also understood that the fight wasn't over. The HOA wasn't going to roll over and admit defeat, not without a fight. And sure enough, within days, they came knocking again. This time, they didn't send Mr. Thompson or another board member. They sent lawyers. It started with a formal letter delivered by courier early one morning. James opened it while sipping his coffee on the porch. The document was dense with legal jargon, but the message was clear: restore water access immediately or face criminal charges. They cited trespassing, vandalism, and reckless endangerment among their list of accusations. It was heavy-handed, designed to intimidate. But instead of scaring James, it only hardened his resolve. He called a trusted neighbor who happened to know a lawyer in the next town over a guy named Bill who specialized in property disputes. Bill agreed to meet with James at a diner halfway between their homes. Over plates of greasy eggs and toast, James explained everything: the barn demolition, the pipeline shutdown, the HOA threats. Bill listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but mostly staying quiet until James finished. When he finally spoke, Bill's tone was measured. "You're walking a fine line here," he said, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Legally, they've got a case against you. Cutting off someone else's water supply is serious business. But," he paused, leaning forward, "slightly, they've also made mistakes. Big ones. If we play this right, we might be able to turn the tables." Bill helped James draft a counteroffer. In exchange for restoring water access, James demanded three things: full financial compensation for the loss of his barn, a public apology from the HOA acknowledging their role in the dispute, and a promise to reform their policies to ensure transparency and fairness moving forward. It was a bold move, but James felt it was fair. After all, they had started this mess by tearing down his livelihood without warning. To everyone's surprise, including James' own, the HOA blinked. First, facing mounting pressure from residents, bad press, and the looming cost of a legal battle, they reluctantly agreed to negotiate. It wasn't an easy process. Meetings stretched late into the night, tempers flared, and compromises were hard won. But eventually, they reached a deal. The HOA paid James for the destruction of his barn, waiving all future dues and fees associated with his membership. More importantly, they issued a public statement apologizing for their handling of the situation and promising reforms. They pledged to hold regular meetings where residents could voice concerns, review proposed rule changes, and vote on major decisions. For the first time in years, the HOA seemed genuinely interested in serving the community rather than controlling it. As word spread about the settlement, reactions varied. Some celebrated James as a champion of justice, someone who had dared to challenge authority and win. Others remained skeptical, wondering how long the HOA's newfound commitment to fairness would last. But even the doubters couldn't deny that something significant had shifted in Willow Creek. People were paying closer attention now to the rules, to the leaders, to each other. The old ways of doing things wouldn't fly anymore. For James, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could get. With the compensation money, he rebuilt his barn, this time painting it gray to avoid any further conflict. He expanded his sheep operation, buying a few more acres of land and investing in better equipment. Neighbors stopped by more often, bringing pies, offering help, or just sitting on the porch to chat. James found himself smiling more, feeling lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. But the biggest change wasn't in his barn or his bank account, it was in the way people treated each other. Farmers shared tools and advice more freely. Shopkeepers went out of their way to support local businesses. Even the HOA board members seemed different, less aloof and more willing to listen. The water crisis had exposed cracks in the foundation of the community, but it had also given them a chance to rebuild stronger than before. One crisp autumn afternoon, James stood on the edge of his property, looking out at the fields stretching toward the horizon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light across the landscape. For the first time in months, he felt truly at peace. The battle had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it had also taught him something important. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about making room for others to stand alongside you. Later that evening, as he sat on the porch watching the stars come out, a truck pulled into his driveway. Out stepped the elderly farmer who had visited him weeks earlier, along with a few others from town. They carried guitars, fiddles, and bottles of homemade cider. Without saying a word, they set up chairs in the yard and began playing music.
Filling the air with laughter and song. James joined them,
passing around mugs of cider and sharing stories under the starlit sky. No one mentioned the water crisis or the HOA. There was no need. What mattered was that they were here together, celebrating not just survival but resilience. In that moment, surrounded by friends and neighbors, James realized something profound. The real victory hadn't been shutting off the water or forcing the HOA to apologize. It had been reminding everyone, including himself, that when people come together, they can overcome almost anything. And so, life in Willow Creek moved forward. The scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but they served as reminders of lessons learned and battles fought. James became something of a legend in town, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he'd inspired: unity, courage, and hope. His story was proof that even in the face of injustice, one person could make a difference, and that sometimes fighting fire with fire was the only way to spark real change. Underneath the wide-open skies of Willow Creek, the field swayed gently. In the breeze, carrying whispers of the past and promises of the future. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. And for James Callahan, that was enough.